Jamestown was the first permanent English settlement in 1609. When English settlers arrived, they encountered the Powhatan Indians, who were a confederacy, or a group of Native Americans in the region. Captain John Smith, who was the young leader of the early Jamestown settlers, convinced the settlers that in order to eat, they needed to work. He was also instrumental in organizing reciprocal and mutually beneficial cooperation with the Powhatan Indians in terms of food and trade. There was little conflict between the settlers and Powhatan Confederacy until the death of Chief Powhatan, after which conflict would escalate. Slavery in Jamestown. The British war vessel, the White Lion, had raided a Portuguese ship for human cargo and made its way to the American shores. In the words of John Rolfe, 20 and odd Negroes arrived in Jamestown in 1619. Slavery versus indenture meant that slavery was a permanent institution where indenture is something you could work off. These terms were perhaps more fluid in early Virginia and denote the complicated evolution of slavery in the colonies. It was more important that one be religious and own property to determine status. Not to say race was unimportant, but it was not number one on the list. Freedom could be granted or purchased, and Virginia courts also determined issues of freedom. In the case of Anthony Johnson, he was enslaved by a Virginia family and permitted to obtain his freedom. This came because he worked off his enslavement or his indenture, depending on how you look at it. He was one of the first African American property owners, and the Virginia courts recognized his right to legally own a slave. In the language of the time, most likely the person that he, quote, owned was more of an indentured servant. Elizabeth Key is another case. She was the daughter of an enslaved African woman and a British man who served in Virginia's House of Burgesses. She lived with her politician godfather after her dad's death in 1636, where she was treated as an indentured servant. She was then sold to a judge who treated her as a permanent slave. After his death, she went to court and sued his estate for her freedom and won. Laws became more restrictive and race-based after the 1660s. In 1705, the House of Burgesses passed the Virginia Slave Code, dictating the behavior and enslavement of slaves and their masters. Today, Jamestown is a continuing archaeological dig where they continue to find more information about material culture and the way people lived. It's important to realize that there was some level of cooperation between the Powhatan Indians and the Jamestown settlers, but not all was rosy. We also have seen the complicated evolution of the history of slavery in the region, which helps us as we go into our next unit.